So this is just to get a sense from everybody about where you're at when it comes to how your organization is doing around digital and hybrid service delivery. So do you feel like you're just surviving, like you're just figuring this out, you're still trying to figure it out, you're just getting by, you're doing what you need to do? Of course you're using digital tools because we just came out of a pandemic experience, but you're really just still focused on short-term goals. You don't have an emerging strategy. Or are you striving? You're actually starting to work on a strategy. You're planning and talking about how your work is changing. You've got some medium-term goals, like in the next 6 months, we want to plan our remote work in these ways. We want to bring newcomers into the conversation to understand where they're at a little bit. Or are you thriving? Are you digitally mature as an organization where you're now at the point where you've got a hybrid service strategy, you've got long-term goals, you're implementing this strategy, you've got people getting the training, you understand and are involving newcomers in the service provision? So spend a minute just voting on that to see where you're at. And so this is the live result as you're doing it, so you can see where people are at. So 31, it's a good number, but if folks want to keep going, I want to say, as I'm watching this is pretty typical with results in other sessions that I've been part of. There's still a significant group of organizations that feel like they're still just surviving. So you're not alone there. If you feel like you're alone, that's part of why we have to have this conversation. Most organizations are definitely in the middle, right? About 2/3 in this case, who are, we're planning, we're moving forward. We feel like we've got the beginnings of a strategy. We've got a bit of a handle on this. Very few are in the thriving stage, right? This idea of being a very digitally mature organization with a strategy. Newcomers are involved. We're using data to help lead where we're going. This bar graph really is consistent with what I'm seeing out in the sector as well. All right, 37. So we'll end it there. Let's move on to the next one then. So the next question is a little bit more complex. And what I want to do here, and let me just go to the next slide in the slides, is to do a little bit of myth and assumption busting. So I've got 7 statements, and I want you to tell me whether you think it's how true or false you think it is, and how certain you are of that, right? So what I mean by that is what we're going to end up with is a bit of a matrix here where you'll say, I know this is true, but I'm not totally certain. So it'll show up here. Or I'm absolutely certain that this is a little true, right? So it's kind of like the idea is, how true or false do you think this statement is, but how certain are you of that? So there's seven statements to go through and to rate them as you're going along, and it'll start to show up live here on the matrix. And so the idea here is for us to figure out as a sector, and again, it's interesting to see the results when I've done this with others about, we want these communities of practice. We want to be sharing, if we had space for it together. Is every frontline worker a digital navigator now? Is that part of everybody's job? Is professional development, in particular when it comes to hybrid services and digital, is that hard or easy to access? I hear from a lot of people that it's hard to access. You may or may not agree with that. Newcomers are more digitally literate than service providers. Where are your feelings on that? Do you feel that that's true, that that's not true? Again, based on your experience. When we say hybrid service delivery, does that mean that newcomers need to choose one or the other, or is it both, right? They access your services sometimes online, sometimes in person. And the final question is about, again, the purpose of this conversation. Who should lead us, right? So should we wait for the provincial national networks, like the umbrella organizations, to lead us in a conversation about delivering a hybrid service vision and framework? So as you can see, we've got 3 people in, and what you'll see and what's interesting and why I asked the question in this way is as it changes. So for the first one, we want to and will share, collaborate, network, and learn together if we just had the space for it. So people are suggesting that it's fairly true, but some people are not certain, right? So these little offshoots tell us their certainty. So we're at kind of a 2 around true, but some people feel very strongly about that they're not certain if that's true, and others feel about medium certain about how true that is. And part of doing this is to show just how much diversity there is around the opinions on these things in our sector, and to share this with each other. For question 1, who are we sharing, learning, and collaborating with? Service users, that's a good question. So service users, frontline workers, or between organizations. So I would say that when we're talking about collaborating, it's together. So it's amongst service providers. Great question. But you can also define that as with other sectors as well. But generally, I'm talking about within the sector, so that as service providers, we want and will share, collaborate, network, and learn with other service providers if we had the space to do it. And I think that's an important caveat, right? Because just wanting to do it is one thing, but having the space and the resources to do it is something else. Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, I like this one too. It's a lot of fun to sort of see. You can start to see the divergence, right? So professional development is hard to access. A number of people, it's true. A number of people, false, but certainty is different, right? So some people think it's true, but they're uncertain. And that's okay, right? Maybe you don't know if it's hard or easy to access. And that's useful information because it tells us that I think it's hard, but I'm not sure, which means maybe you just don't know where to access it, or no one's given you information about it. Let's see, 6. Hybrid service delivery is either or. False, and people are quite certain, but some people are uncertain, and some people think it's true. Great diversity of this again. Agencies should wait. Some people think we should. Most people think we shouldn't so far. Newcomers are more digitally literate. This always lands in the middle. I love this one because it's the short answer is it depends, right? Some people will have the experience of newcomers who are much more digitally literate and prepared. And a lot of you will have the experience of those who aren't. So just look at where this shoots out, right? So a number of people think it's true with high levels of certainty. A number of people think it's false, but they're quite uncertain. A bunch of people are landing in the middle of both. I think it's true, and I'm pretty certain I think it's true. I think it's false, and I'm pretty uncertain about that, though. So it just gives us a really good sense of where we are at when it comes to these kinds of questions. And again, these are all part of the nuances of the conversation that we want to be having. So we're at 28. I'll give you another couple of minutes, and then we can talk through this a little bit. But it's really just to give you a sense of, where we think we are as a sector when it comes to understanding some of these questions, some of these myths. So, for example, again, the myth of the newcomer is either completely digitally literate or the newcomer is not digitally literate at all, right? And some of those myths and assumptions come from our experiences. Some of it comes from research. Some of it comes from, just anecdotes and things like that. And the question is, what is the right answer, and how do we address this if it's a challenge across the organization? So we had 30 people. We've got 49 on the call, or 48 of you on the call. 30 have weighed in here. I'm going to let you continue to weigh in, but I'm just going to run through them once again. So again, if we had the space for it, most of you would want to collaborate, share, and learn together. And this is something that comes out really clearly in the research as well around knowledge mobilization in our sector. We want to learn from each other. We want to share practices and learn from other people's practices, but also share and learn from our own practices. And I think that's something that's really valuable, is that we want to be part of that space, but we just don't have the space for it. The second one, we have the communities of practice we need in order to get and share information in the sector. Now, this is really interesting because it's quite a huge split. The short answer is we do. We have a number of formal communities of practice where we can have these conversations. So there's settlenet.org, which is the sort of general community of practice. There's the National Newcomer Navigation Network, which is focused more on healthcare, but also is quite broad in its scope. There's the CAMH, Immigrant and Refugee Mental Health Initiative, which is a training program, but also has a community of practice around mental health. There are the local immigration partnerships, have a community of practice and a network where they share. And there are a few others. There's also folks who are working with government-assisted refugees. There's a community of practice specifically for those organizations. And there are a few others here and there. But there are also informal ones where in a regional or in a sector-specific focused area, you might have a community of practice where you're engaging. So the reality is that we actually have these spaces, right? But going back to the first one, I think one of the questions is if we had the space to use them, right? So do we need more communities of practice? Do we need more websites and infrastructure? Or do we simply need something different? But the fact that we're not sure that this is true is something that's really interesting in the data. So the third one, every frontline worker is a digital navigator. It's part of all our jobs now. Again, huge divergence here, right? So my short answer to you and the pitch today is the answer is yes. right? And that's a hard thing, but that's the evolution of where these jobs are going, is everyone has to be, and what is it, but what is a digital navigator? So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that today, but digital navigator and digital champion are actually two programs. The digital navigator program emerged out of the United States, and the digital champion model comes from the UK. And the idea is that you are literate enough to help somebody else access the internet or learn some basic skills and things like that. The way we're using it in our sector is, in particular in the language sector, but also in settlement, that there are actually new jobs emerging called the digital navigator, where they will help clients onboard into the systems that the organization is using. So here's how you use Zoom, here's our learning management system, here's how we use email, things like that. But they're really there to help train and escalate some of the technology. It's still everybody's role now at the front line to understand this technology as well, and to be kind of almost like a first level of triage and support for their clients. Now that adds more complexity to the job, but it's emerging as a shift in the role. In the same way that every job ad must know, Microsoft Office, for example. We're eventually going to start seeing different kinds of competencies and expectations at the hiring of frontline folks. So it's a really interesting moment in this conversation, because it is both a separate job as well as part of the role of everyone. And I'll once again, after this, I'll share some resources to help expand on that. Our next one, professional development is hard to access. Interesting. Again, there are tons of places where you can access professional development, both for free and at cost, as well as supports in order to access it. So every provincial umbrella organization runs workshops, training programs, seminars, professional development conferences. In Ontario in particular, you can actually access dollars through OCASI from the professional education and training program. It's up to $3,000 for a team or an organization. And I think, I'm not sure what it is at the individual level, but to help pay for a course or to help bring a facilitator or a consultant in. But I would say part of the question is it hard to access, or do we know what we need to get training on, right? And those are two sides of the same coin. In terms of being able to access that, and what time in our lives do we devote to that? Can I access this training during work hours? Am I expected to do it after hours? And that's a huge issue in not only our sector, but many sectors. The individualization of training, you are expected to be lifelong learners now, right? Then there's also the free areas where you can learn things, right? So there's actually a lot of really interesting training on things like LinkedIn Learning, which you can actually access for free through your library in most cases, and other online courses. But half the battle is, how do I know that this is the right course that's going to have the outcome for me and to help improve my job? So in terms of access, it's not just about knowing where to go and who's a legitimate service provider, because there are so many now, but it's understanding whether this will have an impact in the way you want it to in your own work. And the fifth one, newcomers are more digitally literate than service providers. So again, the evidence shows that the vast majority of them are, right? But there are definitely pockets and percentages depending on the demographics and countries of origin and experiences that fit into this. Part of this conversation is around sometimes the devices, right? So our services are predominantly, it's changing because of the pandemic, but they're predominantly, you need a computer, you need a large screen. So it's a tablet, a desktop, or a laptop in order to access those services. And newcomers predominantly use smartphones. So the disconnect sometimes isn't whether they're literate, it's whether we're reaching them using the modalities and devices that they actually are using. And so again, there's lots of research on this, and we're changing and we're learning, and it requires tools that we choose that fit with the clients. It's also around assumptions, right? So one of my favorite stories is the Costi works with government-assisted refugees in the GTA, and they worked a lot with the Yazidi population during the influx from Syria. And the Yazidi population was generally illiterate in their own language, and also and therefore also in English. So they didn't speak they didn't read or write in their own language, but they all had phones with WhatsApp on it. And they used those phones to share video and audio messages. So they were actually highly digitally literate, and it taught the Costi staff about how to use technology with them. So for example, some of them might live in York Region, and Costi's office is in downtown Toronto. In the past, they would have to, someone would say, oh, I got this letter, I don't know what it means. So they would have to drive up to look at it, or the person would have to mail it to them. Now with their smartphone, they took a picture of it, they sent it to their worker could read that letter and say, nothing to worry about, or pay your bills, because this is telling you that you owe your electricity bill or whatever it might be. It had incredible impact on their ability to provide service. But if you assume that literacy was connected to digital literacy and didn't take in some of those nuances, you would have assumed that Yazidis were probably not digitally literate, but they were in the specific way that they were able to be. And so those are some of the really interesting nuances around, are we asking, and I know an organization, for example, when Syrians came in, this was our introduction in the sector to WhatsApp, right? It was kind of there before, but we really didn't use it a lot. There were organizations that didn't have the permission or the funding to buy smartphones in order to use WhatsApp. So they trained their Syrian clients on how to use email, right? And you can make a long-term argument that that's useful for them for seeking employment and all those things. But in the immediate intervention stage, what would have made more sense was using WhatsApp with them, right? And then training them on email later. But they couldn't do that for a number of reasons, organizationally and from funding purposes. So the assumption is, well, they're not digitally literate enough to access our services. And the question is, how do we meet them in the middle with that kind of a question? So I'm just going to the chat because there's a couple of questions. What about security around use of smartphones and apps like WhatsApp? Yes, that is one of the important questions that will come up in our conversation. And it's something that is part of being that digital navigator. Once again, you need to understand the implications of using your tools. So WhatsApp, still owned by Meta, still an encrypted messaging platform, not a private platform, right? And some of the things we have to do is figure out the differences between privacy and encryption. So with WhatsApp, for example, in order to use it, you need to connect it to your cell phone number, which means if I share messaging with you, that person will see your smartphone number. If I interact in a group with other people, those people will see my smartphone number. So that's a privacy challenge. Also, Meta collects some what they call metadata information that they can't see your messages. They can't see into those messages or the files you share and things like that, but they can see where you're accessing it and things like that. So there are some concerns around privacy versus security versus encryption, for example, in all of these tools. And part of our challenge as a sector is that we need to become more and more aware of the implications of the different tools that we're using. So there's some, really interesting if-then kinds of graphs that you'll have where someone is, okay, I connected with them on Facebook, and now they're starting to share personally identifiable information with me. What does that mean for how I interact with them? I need to shift them off of Facebook into a more secure platform. And that's not going to be on Facebook anymore, right? It's going to be on a different platform, for example. So how do you know how to do that? And how do you make sure that that you understand the implications of sharing on one platform and moving someone to another? And those are complex. It's a great question, though. It's an important question because that's now something where we have to understand the implications of that. And yeah, as Emil is saying, to understand the implications in the mind of students where certain tech was used against them in their home country, right? So one of the things we've seen, for example, is refugees from certain countries tend to be much more well-versed in surveillance tactics of technology than we might be, right? Because it was used against them. And even traveling through Europe, right? Border surveillance, all of those kinds of things come into play. So we have to understand our security hygiene might be less than the people we're serving because they have had surveillance or other technologies used actually against them and their families. So good examples. Early days, for example, with Facebook, people were sharing stories about their clients, right? But if those clients were identifiable in those stories and people in the home country, the country of origin where they came from could see that, it could be used against their families. So some of the things you do is you anonymize them, but you also can restrict where your Facebook posts are visible in different countries, for example. So this was a refugee-serving organization, so they actively restricted what countries could access their postings in order to help protect that, even in the event that the description was too dead on, that person was identifiable and therefore their family could be impacted, even if there weren't photos and things like that. So privacy, security, confidentiality, these are all important parts of our roles as digital navigators, for example. So hybrid service delivery is either or. Newcomers need to choose between in person, both virtually and in person, and they can shift between those modalities. So we're learning a lot, for example, about the preferred experience of newcomers and frontline workers when it comes to the in-person. So a lot of people want to meet for the first time in person so they can actually establish a connection. And then after that, for the transactional elements, if they're digitally literate enough, if they have the devices, if they have the bandwidth, if they're comfortable with technology, amongst a number of other factors, they will then choose to interact virtually, but they might want to have that option to come back in person. And for social and human connections with other newcomers, for example, we hear from a lot of newcomers that the serendipity of going to like a workshop in an office means they get the information, but then they connect with other newcomers and there's less isolation that way. And maybe they go for a drink after, or they just go for a walk together and they get to know each other. Part of the challenge is, and what I like to push back on is, that's replicable online, but it takes a lot more effort to create those social interactions, because the reality is they're already doing it in WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups and Telegram groups and WeChat groups. People are making human interaction connections. So how can you mimic that in the online space? But the idea is, for people who prefer some experiences in person, but are happy to do some online, hybrid allows them to make those choices and to move back and forth between those modes. And that's something that's really important. So yeah, most of you got it. It's not either or, it's both virtual and in person. And the final one, agency should work for regional, wait for our networks to lead. And you're right, I agree. We should not be waiting for the networks to agree. And again, that's why I think you're here and why this conversation today is kind of so important, is we have been waiting, right? We have a number of reports, we have a number of recommendations. Everybody is doing this work, and as you saw in our first poll, not everyone is feeling comfortable about where they're at around surviving and striving, for example. And so we want to have some leadership, but we don't want to wait for it until it's too late. There's a national call for proposals coming out in a couple of years from IRCC, or in a year, and we know digital is going to be on that agenda. So how do we lead that agenda with IRCC instead of waiting for it, for example?